Welcome to the Canine Classroom, a podcast for dog owners, training professionals, and dog enthusiasts where we discuss training, behavior issues, and everything in between. We're two friends and dog trainers that share a passion for dogs. We're constantly learning and exploring to become better at what we do while also questioning each other and our own thoughts. We're here to provide helpful advice, have open conversations, ask questions, get answers, as well as hear from colleagues and experts in the industry, regardless of method and training style. So take a seat and get your notepad out because class is in session. Hey everyone, welcome to the Canine Classroom. I'm Anthony DeMarinis. I'm here with my buddy Vinny Viola, and today our guest is Jo-Rosie Haffenden. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
What's going on, guys?
Doing all right. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. It's a bit cold in Spain at the moment. I don't know why, but it's cold here for once. So
it's warm here. It's like 60 degrees in February in New York. I'll take it.
Yeah, I know. It's so warm here.
Yeah.
It's actually nice. I can go train afterwards because it's so nice out and I have a break. What time is it over there by you?
It's 6:45. So
okay.
The dogs have been fed, but that doesn't mean they're calm. But they've been fed.
They're ready to go.
Yeah, well, I have three working Malinois, a Bulldog Boxer, and a Vizsla. The Vizsla's cool.
Yeah.
She sleeps.
Oh boy.
So
you got a full house.
A full house, yes.
So why don't you introduce yourself? That way it'll save me the trouble of stumbling when I read the bio.
For sure. Okay, so my name's Jo-Rosie Haffenden, and if you don't know me, then my background was originally I did a applied psychology degree, and then I did a postgraduate in animal behaviour. So I kind of came up a university route and then dived straight into practical and started working at a large rescue organisation. But I got really into pit bulls while I was there. So then I became an expert witness for the court and worked in England doing expert witness work. Trying to advocate for dogs and sometimes for their owners actually in court when dogs were in trouble with law, either because of what type of dog they were or because they bit people and caused damage and stuff like that. And then from there, I just started my own practice and had 8 members of staff and grew that. And then I was lucky enough to be invited by Channel 4 to come and present some television programs. So I did 3 TV shows in the UK. And then published 3 books as well. And then I've been absolutely lucky to be given an opportunity to kind of explore the globe and go all across Europe and America and New Zealand and India and all over the place looking at dogs, and also teaching people at my company, which is called the School of Canine Science. And then I had a baby and I thought, why not put all this stuff online, which is what we did.
Well, you just saved me from having to read all that. There's been a lot of stumbling going on. Am I wrong, Vinny?
Very impressive. I like it.
So now what I do is I basically, most days I still just get up and train dogs. But now there's a video camera in front of me most of the time. And I'm still presenting a lot, but I also train the sport of Mondio Ring, which is I'm going to say it's my hobby because it really isn't my profession, but it definitely weaves itself into pretty much everything I do now as a dog trainer. So
very interesting.
I was just say that seems to show up a lot in a lot of your videos.
For sure.
We wanted to kind of have you on to discuss a little bit or a lot of it about the science in quotes, the science in air quotes,
Science.
Because I think one thing that I've been noticing and Vinny's been noticing is that it's thrown out a lot in terms of like the phrase "the science" is thrown out a lot today in our industry. So I kind of want to know, like, what does that mean? So what is the science and how should we be looking at it? And is this science something that should be questioned or not, etc., etc.?
So I have a lot of frustrations with the science, even though I come from a very scientific family and a very scientific background. And that's because science is just a method of inquiry. It's just the way that we look at something. And it basically is is a way of trying to standardize and put systems in place so that we can look at patterns and see how reliable patterns are, really. Patterns of everything, like whether or not it's like blood types, whether or not we can categorize them systematically, or whether or not it's how those blood types then affect our pain threshold or our personality or whatever. And it's just different ways of measuring stuff and categorizing stuff, really. But people have kind of decided, especially in our industry, that the science actually means the truth. And it never means the truth. Like, there are no facts. Like, science doesn't give us facts, it just gives us data. And that data is just representative of the method used to collect that data. And so there's a huge problem, I think, at the moment, whereby science has kind of become the new religion in dog training, and everybody believes wholeheartedly that if the science says something, now the science doesn't say anything, but if the science says something, that is then the truth. So they can go, well, the science says that dogs find, let's say, dogs find being tapped on the nose by a newspaper highly stressful. Now, we all know there's thousands of different variables that might impact that. So how large the dog is and how small the dog is. Studies have actually shown that how large and how small the dogs are impacted how aversive they found an e-collar, for example. So we know that aversiveness is impacted by things like size, age, weight, personality, how it's applied, whether or not it's controllable by the animal, whether or not they understand how they can avoid it, whether or not it's uncontrollable, whether or not it comes through the floor, whether or not it comes through the collar, like all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different variables. And so it's kind of almost impossible to say the science says anything, because it doesn't. The science says whatever has been studied. So the science might say that a sample of 3 9-week-old Labrador puppies found it aversive when I raised my voice, but it wouldn't even say that they found it aversive. It'd say that their cortisol levels were higher, or it might say that they moved more. But people take the discussions of scientists as a representation of what the data has said, and they fail to often recognize the fact that the discussions of the scientists are massively biased and impacted by the experiences of said scientists, which often are not in dog training. So this is some of my frustrations with the whole science says thing. The other frustration is, of course, that science is just like one element, isn't it? Like becoming a dog trainer, there's a whole argument to be put forward. Some of the best dog trainers I know, practically speaking, know very little to nothing about the science. And I have some brilliant conversations with particularly quite a well-known IGP competitor who is phenomenal practically and admits that she doesn't know any of the science. And she'll say, why does this work, Jo? And I go, well, this works because blah, 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 blah. And so when you're training dogs to do behavior, especially, and we're not necessarily talking about training dogs to stop behavior, because I think that's slightly different, but when we're training dogs to do behavior, there is an argument to say that the science is secondary to the practical experience and the knowledge and the mechanics and the know-how.
That's kind of nice to hear, because I get stressed out when I don't always know all the science or the things that the studies say or whatever. So that's kind of nice to hear that there are other people out there who feel the same.
The other thing to remember is that science is pointless without the practical. Like, where does science come from? Like, science comes from having a question, right? So in order to do any science, we have to have a question about something. And those questions they come from doing stuff, right? So we go, every time I touch my dog after training, he's warm. Why? And then we use science to try and discover why our dogs are warm after they've participated in dog training, I don't know, or whatever. But the question has to come first, and the value of the answer is only insofar as its practical application.
It's funny you say that, because I had written down some questions ahead of time. And so one of the things I wrote down was, like, to me, like, from my understanding, science is based off of questions, asking questions. And I find it interesting because we're pushing the science, and then at the same time, if you question it, you're an asshole. You know,
crazy. Like I think science literacy is really, really important. I think a lot of the universities, and I'm definitely going to be slaughtered for saying this, but I don't care. A lot of the universities, including even where I learn, are attempting to train, instead of training dog trainers to be dog trainers and dog behaviorists to be dog behaviorists, they're trying to train scientists. And I think it really frustrates me, because I'm like, dog trainers need to be science literate. They don't need to conduct research. Like, that's not the job. The job isn't to conduct research. And perhaps the best way to become science literate is to conduct research. And that's fine. I take that. But if someone's very, very good at conducting research, that doesn't make them a dog trainer. And vice versa. I mean, look at Ivan. Ivan is super at training dogs. But I would like to see him carry out some research, because sometimes his ability to pick apart the science is very low level.
It's also funny because as I was reading through some of these studies, like from the American Veterinary Society of Animal Behavior, and some of the studies actually that Ivan presented in his recent podcast about the science. One thing I found that was actually very interesting, and I guess I've never paid attention to it enough, how many of the papers explaining the studies, or how many of the studies themselves actually say what could have been done differently or better, or what is found inconclusive. So I find it interesting because I know I have some quotes I've written down in my notes that I'm not going to find at the moment because I'm saying this, but there were a few of the articles that like basically were showing where they had flaws and what they would look at differently. So one of the studies, actually the one I was texting you about this morning, Vinny, was first of all, some of them are all based on questionnaire, which I didn't realize how many studies actually are from questionnaire. There are not as many out in the world observation hands-on. So I know you're going to want to touch on that because I could see you're jumping out of your seat. But the other thing that I also found interesting was in one of the studies, they did go out and observe, but it was only 2 group classes. They went to observe a school that was doing group classes using more aversive methods, and they went to a school that was using more positive-based methods. And it was only based on 2 observations of classes, which I found so interesting because it was such a small number. And actually, like in the paper, it said one of the flaws was that we should have looked at more training facilities to determine X, Y, and Z. And then they even like started in the same paper, they were even talking about the use of tools like e-collars and how a lot of the dogs actually did better using positive reinforcement than using an e-collar. But then it said, like, again, the flaws, well, we didn't know if the collar was used before or after a behavior problem, how severe the dog's behavior problem was, if it was related to predation or chasing, which was interesting. And then the other thing that was interesting is they didn't know what the owner considered to be successful or not. So even though it was a presentation on utilizing, trying to figure out what is more effective using punishment-based methods or more a positive-based approach, they, in the end, even though it concluded, well, it looked like positive reinforcement was actually a much better and fair approach for the situation they were in, they couldn't answer all the other questions, which was interesting because then it's like, well, there's a lot of flaws now, after, I mean, it's not even that the presentation is wrong or that the answers are incorrect, in their findings, but it's just interesting that there are actually a lot more questions that need to be answered then.
One of my biggest problems
which blew my mind because I'm just like I'm a horrible reader and like this stuff overwhelms me. So as I read, I was like, Jesus, like this is insane.
So I think a lot of people who are quite new to reading science are always surprised by, there's a big problem, which is sample size. You want a lot of people in your sample. The more dogs, the better, but then that's going to massively impact your methodology. collecting surveys is, especially with the internet, the easiest way to get a massive sample size, without a doubt. But whether or not that data that comes back is truly valid to the question, or reliable, is most definitely questionable. One of the studies that I love thinking about is the study of there's a certain polymorphism, like a genetic mutation that Malinois suffer with, and polyo22. Lots of people have heard of it. And it's one of these things that it seems to be only Mallies, or really only Mallies that struggle with it. And everybody knows it as the aggression gene, right? So it's this gene. One of my dogs, I don't know where he is, but my main competition dogs, he's got polyo22. But anyway, we had all mine tested because just for fun, really. Just because I wanted to make a prediction before we got the answers back, and then get the answers. But anyway, and Blake has it, but it's got this reputation as the aggression one. The study on that is ludicrous, and whether or not it's aggressive or not, it all depends on a questionnaire that the owners answered. And the question is, I'm going to get the wording wrong, but the question is something along the lines as, has your Malinois ever shown aggression, or gone to bite or bitten a dog or a person? And I'm like, find me one where the answer is no. Like especially because most of these are adolescents, and you're like, what do you mean? Yeah, like pretty much every day one of them will get my arm, or but and like those things just blow your mind, because you're like, that completely muddies the whole of that study, because it doesn't show any level of reliability or validity, or because nobody who is a professional was assessing these dogs that come and are going through these surveys. They're just dog owners who are going, yeah, he seems happy, tick.
Well, I was going to just say, it also would depend, I guess, and this is where it gets interesting, because then it also depends, what do you consider biting?
Exactly. Absolutely. Like 100%. So definitions are so important, and definitions are one of the biggest things I think that is problematic, particularly in this argument of, for the moment, let's say balance versus positive reinforcement trainers or whatever. Because I think one of the definitions that until we get this clear, until we all agree this, it's every single study that's been done might as well be torn up into tiny little pieces and put through the shredder. Because what we need to agree is, how aversive is too aversive, and how do we measure that? That's what we need to agree, right? Because it doesn't matter if you're a balance trainer or a positive reinforcement trainer, or whether or not you're knowingly using things that scare or frighten dogs or not, right? It doesn't matter. That's what's important. We know that low levels of stress, tolerable stress, when overcome, it improves health, improves stress, improves resilience, improves learning ability, it improves all this stuff. So we know that some level of aversive, some level of tolerable stress can be a really good thing, right? We know this to be true. We also know that certain levels of stress are incredibly detrimental to your immune system, incredibly detrimental to neurogenesis, can cause shutdown and learned helplessness and all these other things that then prevent an animal from learning again in the future. But we need to agree between all of us how aversive is too aversive, because saying training that uses aversives, it is just stupid, isn't it? Because every like what's really interesting to me is when I work with balance trainers, and when I work with force free trainers, and it comes to teaching a behavior, like let's say we're teaching the dog to get on a platform, yeah? So the dog gets on the platform, excellent, feed, both parties do the same, they both feed the dog on the platform, woohoo, right? The dog comes off the platform when it shouldn't come off the platform. Now the force free community walk over to the platform to help lure the dog back onto the platform. The balance community walk towards the dog towards the platform to use spatial pressure to push the dog back on. It's both exactly the same. If you were to video it, you couldn't tell the two things apart. But one group of people will say it's spatial pressure, and the other one will say they're helping the dog. And so much of this is just semantics, right? And a lot of the time we aren't particularly good in the more force-free camp at being aware of things like spatial pressure and eye contact, and how much these things, and how our body posture and leaning over dogs, and how much these things are impacting the behavior. And because the balance community are more comfortable with knowingly using things that put pressure on the dogs, they're also seem to be a lot more capable of articulating that in a particular training scenario. And but both parties do the same. Both parties use both. We're all clearly comfortable with using spatial pressure, because so many of the techniques across the board use spatial pressure or use eye contact to push a dog or whatever. And yet, without a line of saying, well, this much is too much, then all of the studies that look at stress signals without looking at the longevity of the responses of the animals, so all of the studies that then look at and say, well, using these methods, there were more stress signals within the session than using these methods, all of that is it's redundant data. It's pointless unless the stress signals are indicative of something that's too aversive, that is counterproductive and not good for the dog. Because if it isn't counterproductive and not good for the dog, then what's the problem? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, and then the one thing that struck me by surprise with a lot of the studies were, like, for example, with electric collar, they're just using the electric collar at the highest level. Like, it's just all the way to the top, which, like, or the punishment would be like kicking the dog. You know what I mean? Like, or like hitting the dog. And I was like, whoa. And then, like, there were studies where the electric collar was actually the lowest, like, in terms of what was perceived as aversive by that study, because the other things were like kicking the dog in the chest or like punching the dog. And then, which I feel like is an unfair representation, because at least the balance trainers that I've learned from and I follow and I enjoy, they're not using the tools like that. And then to your example, with spatial pressure, I feel like even me personally, of intentionally using spatial pressure and intentionally using leash pressure, I'm showing my dogs that way ahead of ever needing to use it. So then in the example that they are on a box and then they get off and then I step into their space, they're going to be more prepared for that and then less stressed out by it than maybe by someone that's doing it without even realizing that it might be a thing. You know what I mean? I think, did we lose her?
Oh, there we go.
Oh, we lost you for a second. You're back.
Yeah, Spain.
I was like, everything I said is fucking wrong. No.
Yeah, so I got to the point where you're using spatial pressure to put the dog back on the box.
So like if someone, like a balance trainer that is using spatial pressure and is aware that they're using it, you could make the argument that when they use spatial pressure, it's actually less aversive. Again, it depends on the dog and the scenario, than someone that's using spatial pressure without knowing they're doing it. And their dog's never seen spatial pressure before, but they're like, oh, well, I'm just lowering the dog back on the thing. But like, you think you're doing that, but maybe you're stepping into the dog's space. Like, who hasn't worked with someone with a small little dog that has that, like, I don't want to get stepped on type of thing. And the dog is constantly running away from the foot, even though you have cookies there, because it's been stepped on before, so.
And how many times have you seen a trainer using a treat lure, but when they're lifting it over the dog's head and the dog's not sitting, so they're moving their hand,
they're moving towards, and the dog's backing up, and then they're getting closer again,
and the dog's going into a sit because they're pressuring them into it. And but the thing is that the thing that's important is that all of us are saying there's nothing wrong with using that spatial pressure in that situation, so long as there's this one pivotal factor, which is clarity. As long as there's clarity for the animal, for the learner. So as long as the learner understands the lesson, as long as they know how to participate in a way that is beneficial for themselves, then a lot of the problematic stuff goes by the wayside. And I think it's one of those things that as far as my knowledge, and I train with every different type of trainer under the sun, and I would say that across all the different labels, good trainers can be classified by their ability to give the animal clarity, and the shittier trainers, the trainers with the frustrated and redirecting dogs and dogs that are finding it difficulty, to my mind, nearly always can be classified by a lack of clarity in the lesson.
So then, in that same respect, and you've brought up that that's what needs to be measured, and I'm sure it's going to be from dog to dog and situation to situation, but and this is where definitions come in, is you sometimes hear people talk about, punishing your dog or correcting your dog. And some trainers will have a different definition of each of them. Some people will use them, it's the same thing, like correct your dog or punish your dog. They mean the same thing. But other trainers will see a correction almost more like negative reinforcement, like guidance, like guiding pressure. So where is that line where now you're guiding based on maybe having leverage over your dog versus actually using like pain compliance? And then is that tool dependent? Like, can you, for example, give a dog guiding pressure with a prong collar versus just putting a prong collar on it and like, yanking it? So I don't know if I'm being clear with that question, but
Well, I
like,
think
where is that line
for me, the
crossed?
difference between guiding pressure and punishment would be when it happens, the timing of it. Because if you're guiding a dog into a behavior, then it happens before the behavior. And if you're punishing a dog, then it happens after the behavior, right?
But if there is a pressure that the dog does want to escape, would you still consider that a correction, or are you doing both? If the dog is chasing a squirrel and you say come, and then the dog doesn't, and then you turn on the stim of an electric collar until the dog turns back around, like, is that guiding pressure, or are we, like now there's pain, involved?
Well, then we have to ask the dog. We have to ask the dog.
The dog, yeah.
I don't see why it can't be both, depending on what those definitions are. You're effectively correcting a behavior you don't want. And I guess it depends on what you're measuring, doesn't it? Like, are you measuring the squirrel chasing, or are you measuring the coming back
the recall, to me? Yeah.
Like which one are you measuring? I think this comes down to a fundamental problem, which is that so much emphasis has been put on bloody Skinner and his bloody quadrants.
That was going to be my next question. I love it. It's like me and you planned before this, because I saw you, I think a recent post you just did, and I hear this like, oh, like think beyond the Skinner box. Like you hear that's like almost like a new buzz phrase. Like, oh, like it's like you get into an argument about the quadrants and then people go to that as like a way out. Oh, well, those quadrants don't matter now. Oh, now they don't matter. Okay. So okay. So what does that mean to you when someone says like think beyond Skinner? Like how do you describe that? What does that mean to you?
So for me, as a psychology, initially my first degree was in applied psychology. It's human psychology, but it's applied psychology. And for me, what I find fascinating is that as an industry, dog training is pretty much the only like type of psychology that hasn't completely disregarded this and gone, this is a waste of our time because behavior.
But we spent so long memorizing them. Come on, you can't take them away now. I just started understanding it.
Behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it this stuff is stuff learned from pigeons in labs where they didn't take into consideration things like intrinsic motivation and all this other stuff. And essentially what it's really important to remember about Skinner is that what he designed was a metric, right? That's all he wanted to design. That's all that was. He never called it a quadrant either. That came from a teacher later teaching it. He didn't call it a quadrant, and he never what he did is he designed a way of measuring behavior, because he wanted to basically be able to put his pigeons in the box and go to the pub and come back with these nice little charts that told him like whether or not behavior change had happened or not. So effectively, those 4 terms were created to only be used retrospectively. So it was never about the likelihood. It was about what had happened, right? So whenever we use those terms, we should be saying positive reinforcement has occurred, not that it will occur, because you don't know whether or not
until the future.
Absolutely, it's always in hindsight. And another huge mistake that people make is that it has an emotional contingent. So people say like positive reinforcement, it feels good for the dog, and all of that jazz. But that's not true. I mean, my example today was, if a dog bites me in the foot and I kick him in the face, and he bites me again and I kick him again, and he bites me again and I kick him again, then I've just positively reinforced the biting, right? I've added something that's increased the behavior. Or
could you even say that you negatively reinforce, like the dog is being negatively reinforced because biting you stops you from kicking it?
Well, no, because the biting is a consequence of the behavior. I didn't kick it first.
Oh, okay. So if you were going over and just kicking a dog and then the dog bit you and then you stopped kicking it, like that you could also,
Yeah. But this is the point, right? Because it's nonsensical in that situation. It doesn't matter anyway. But there was never an emotional contingent. And in fact, if you read his books, the reason Skinner didn't didn't study schedules of punishment, that came later by a different scientist, he didn't bother with that, was because he said, oh, there's too much emotion involved and I don't want to study emotion. That's not important to me. Like Thorndike, who did the original cats in boxes study, where he put cats in boxes and gave them basically pleasant or unpleasant things and they had to escape from the boxes. He was all about pleasant and unpleasant consequences. Skinner wasn't. He didn't care about pleasant or unpleasant. He didn't want emotion. He just wanted behavior. It wasn't about the emotional contingent. If there was an emotional contingent, there wouldn't be 4 terms, right? There'd have to be 8, because you'd have to have adding something pleasant that increased behavior, adding something unpleasant that increased behavior, taking something away that was pleasant that increased behavior, taking something away unpleasant that increased behavior, etc., etc., etc. So you'd end up with those 8 boxes and then probably plus extinction as well. So 9 boxes, right? It was never that. So we're using something that was designed as a metric system to be used in hindsight without the emotions to now try and quantify incredibly emotional behavior change. Like we're squishing pegs, like square pegs in round holes, and it doesn't fit. And for that, because of that, people get stuck learning it because it doesn't make any sense half the time, and then they get stuck arguing it because it doesn't make any sense. And then we end up with this weird thing where we have labels of what we do based on a metric system that was completely ill-designed and has been kicked out and no one ever uses in any other form of psychology. It's crazy. And you end up with these massive arguments online. Well, actually, no, I think she's negatively reinforcing it because of this, that. And you're just like, oh my God, this has absolutely no relevance to what's happening at all. Nothing.
So, and it's one of the questions I wrote down for you. I wanted to hear what you would say. I often hear you're not addressing the underlying emotions.
Yes.
And that's in regards to using what is considered, punishment or corrections. But so are we only able to address underlying emotions with reinforcement?
No, not at all. Absolutely not. I mean, essentially, it goes back to Watson and conditioned emotional responses. And he had a child and he conditioned a very negative emotional response to a rabbit, right? By smashing, he had a baby, he used to put it on a mattress, a rabbit came out, and every time the rabbit came out, he smashed a great big hammer against this metal thing, and the baby screamed and cried, and eventually the rabbit itself would elicit this emotional response. And he kind of coined this idea that you could condition emotional responses as well. And when we're talking about using a more Skinnerian model and punishing, so reducing behavior and using aversives to reduce behavior, often they say that the underlying emotion isn't looked at because we're not worried about the fact that Watson, just like Pavlov, is always on our shoulder. And so if I get 10 dogs and I need them in the chest every time they jump up at me, we could be causing a conditioned emotional response where the dogs then say, I hate people because people kick me in the chest every time I greet them. And so sometimes when we look at things through a Skinnerian lens, what we're doing is we are reducing the behavior in question, but because we're not looking at the emotion of the dog and we're not thinking about the emotion of the dog, it's not necessarily going to help the behavior of the dog elsewhere, and it can cause a lot of problems as a result of that. And sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. And it's one of those where understanding the dog in front of you and genuinely being able to take a good assessment of a dog is so important, because actually I think sometimes we can overstate the emotion of the dog. Like, for example, car chasing. A lot of my practitioners get really caught up on what the motivation of the dog is for car chasing, and I'm just like, just teach it to walk on a loose lead. Like, don't worry about it. Just teach it to walk on a loose lead and your problem will be solved. Like, it doesn't, like, sometimes that emotional contingent doesn't really matter, because if we teach it to walk on a nice loose lead, then we're going to be counter conditioning it anyway, because we're going to be feeding it nice stuff or playing good games with it by the car. Like, so a lot of the time it doesn't necessarily matter. And then some of the time it does. And a good practitioner will be able to recognize when you can obedience your way out of a behavior problem and when you actually need to look at the motivations of the dog. The other thing that makes me think about, going back to the kind of like the old sciencey studies, is that a lot of the stuff that Skinner did was with pigeons and targets. And I always find it really interesting, especially, and this other guy, Aslin, I think his name was Azrin. Azin, I think his name was, who studied schedules of punishment. He also did it in a Skinnerian box situation with pigeons pecking targets. And what I find fascinating about using that behavior is that they didn't recognize at the time that that behavior is going to be incredibly intrinsically reinforcing for the animal, because it's pecking behavior and they're birds.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean? Why didn't they do like lever pulling? Because I think the results would have been completely different. And so when we're thinking about looking at like obediencing through a behavior problem, sometimes I think the criticism, whether or not you're using positive reinforcement or whether or not you're using punishment or whether or not you're using negative reinforcement or you're using negative punishment, it's irrelevant when you're kind of obediencing through that one behavior problem without looking at the dog and why the dog is performing that behavior. You can miss really, really important things like the biological fulfillment a dog could get by doing that behavior. So if you've got a dachshund digging in the garden, then the biological fulfillment of that, how intrinsically reinforcing that is going to play a massive part, and you can suppress the behavior via punishment, but the likelihood is you're going to get that drive leaking elsewhere, and the dog's going to then start doing something else naughty. And so I think that's the other thing that people have a problem with when you just look through that Skinnerian box and you're not really thinking about the actual motivations of the animal.
That just made me think of like redirecting behavior, especially like those when you have a drivey puppy or adolescent dog and that dog is just like constantly mouthing or grabbing or whatever. And I know it's just puppy behavior, and then we redirect it, but actually you're reinforcing another response that might actually be teaching that dog to do it more over time.
Yeah, because practice makes permanence, right? So every time we're allowing an animal to practice everything, when the neurogenesis means that the neural pathways are getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So for sure, but equally, you have to balance that up with ideas of motivation and drive, don't you? So you've got things like, there's like a great model called Hull's hydraulic model, which I like. It's a bit debunked and people don't like it for various reasons, but I still like it, especially when it comes to like working dogs. And basically it's a hydraulic model whereby you have like a tap coming out that is meant to be representative of the energy of the dog, and a tank. And the more the tap comes out, the higher the tank gets, and the more drive the dog has to do the behavior kind of thing. But essentially, if you don't use that energy up somewhere, it's going to leak out the edges, isn't it? And it's going to start leaking, and so you're going to end up with an animal that behavior leaks elsewhere. And the balance is that the more you practice the behavior, the more that tap's gonna come out, the more energy the animal is gonna have to perform that behavior, because essentially you're like when you build an athlete, when you build a muscle, when you do anything, you know, the more bite work I do with my dogs, the more water's going to flow out of their bite work tap. And so then the more I'm going to have to look for ways to use that water, otherwise my tank's going to start leaking, and behavior's going to come elsewhere. But every dog has a natural flow of behavior anyway, right? So some dogs have like a really, like my Vizsla, she's 12, and she has a really like slow drip of drive behavior. Like she likes stalking birds a bit. That's about as much as she has naturally. So I can make that flow more by getting her to practice stalking birds and getting her to run and chase the pigeons and that kind of thing. And then I can get a little bit more flow out of the tap. So I've got a bit more water in that tank to use if I want to. Or I can just allow it to drip, 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 drip. But if I do nothing with it at all, after probably about 2 years, I might start getting some leak, right? And then I've got my baby Manamar over there, whose tap is like surging. It's like all day long. And I have to really carefully balance that up with how much time I have to train her and how much ability I have to allow her to get this fulfillment, and making sure that I'm not training her too much so that I'm making a rod for my back and I'm building this athlete that wants to come out biting all day, every day. And I haven't got the ability to do that, and it's going to leak over the edges. So I quite like that engine model, because I think that kind of helps us to look at what you were saying about, you know, every time they practice it, they're strengthening it, it's more likely. And sometimes that's bad, because sometimes you're filling up, you know, you're making that tap flow faster, and that's going to leak out elsewhere. But sometimes, like with a lot of like nice pet spaniels that have been bred as pet spaniels, that you know, we don't need to really worry about that leaking over the edges. And practicing games of tuggy with a staffy, for example, it's with a lot of staffs, that's not really going to leak over the edges. The animal is going to be able to be maintained.
And then I kind of wanted to actually go back to what you said before, because it was actually funny you brought resilience and stress up, because actually it was a question I had written down that I wanted to get your take on. So I don't know who else to ask, so I'm asking this to you because I don't know, like, I kind of feel a little crazy in a way when I think about this, but I feel like there's a lot of push or information out there that stress is always better, that we have to minimize it or avoid it as much as possible. And I see it a lot, and especially in a lot of socialization type stuff with puppies. And I want to know, like, I want to hear your take on that. Is it all bad? Is it actually maybe something that helps build confidence and resiliency in puppies? Should we be shadowing them or hiding like them from all the stress in the world? Or like, I want to like get to the bottom of that question. It's a selfish question for me, because I always like think about this in my head a lot. And I think as someone who, like, as a kid maybe struggled in school, there were certain things that were very stressful that maybe made me want to avoid certain things, but other things that made me really push forward to work through it and pass it, basically, if that makes sense. I get past that. So I'm curious if somehow that could play a role in our dogs, whether it's a pet dog or a more sporty driven type of dog. So yeah, kind of selfish question, but I had that written down, so I want to go back to that.
So I think stress thresholds are really, really relevant, especially to a lot of dog trainers at the moment, because I do think, as you say, I think we're just coming out of it, but we've been living in this kind of this era of like, all stress is bad stress, and all arousal is bad arousal, and we need to keep our dogs calm and asleep all of the time, which is just a load of bullshit, isn't it, really? But I think that it's really important that we stress our dogs out. Really important. I actually want my puppies to experience stress, and I try to stress them. There's just important factors that you've got to understand about stress. So tolerable stress is super, super healthy and really important, because it's the best way to think of it is an inoculation. It's a stress inoculation. You're giving the animal a little bit of stress so that they can deal with stress later, and so they've got the abilities to deal with stress later down the line. It increases confidence, it increases immune system, it has tons and tons and tons of benefits, as long as the animal can overcome the stressor, as long as they can go from a point of being stressed to not being stressed around the trigger or whatever it is. And so I think we need to set up lots and lots of scenarios whereby the animals are getting stressed and then overcoming it, so that when they do in real life meet a scenario where they can't overcome it, it's 1 in 100 rather than the only stressor they've met that's completely uncontrollable. And we can do this by there's two things that we can do. One of the things that we can do is allow this by ensuring that the animal has some level of control over the situation. Now, we have to do that with a pinch of salt, because we know that if something is frightening, or if something is if the animal has got any anxiety about something, then it's going to repel and not attract the animal. So we know that if we give them too much control, they're going to go, see you later. I don't investigate. Right? But we also know that if we give them no control over it at all, then that flooding can go one of two ways. And sometimes flooding can be incredibly and impressively successful. And we can, I've seen dogs flooded by trainers before in a horrifying way, whereby they're literally held with their head in a muzzle between the legs of the trainer, and other dogs come in and sniff them and sniff them and sniff them. They're giving a little bit more control. They give a little bit more freedom and a little bit more freedom, and they correct the dog when it gets wrong. It's horrific. It's horrible. Is it successful? Yeah, sometimes. Horribly. I don't recommend it. It's a horrible method. It's not nice for the animal, and I think it's probably giving a terrible emotional conditioned response to other dogs and to humans. But does it work? Yeah. And flooding can sometimes work. But arguably, when I'm socializing a puppy, I wouldn't look to flood it. I would definitely, I would look for maybe minor flooding sometimes, as long as the animal then has a way of escaping and exit. For me, the most important thing is the Pavlovian response. I want the animal to always want to go back to that scenario. So one way to do that, and something that I've done with, I've hand-reared a bunch of Mallee litters and raised a bunch of litters as well. And one way to do that is to create either a particular pattern or a particular context and novelty right from the word go. So you teach them that always in this space, or always in this room, you're going to find something new, and you're going to have the ability to interact with it. And if you interact with it, something nice will probably happen, and you can probably overcome it. Okay, so like, for example, you see a lot of these assault courses for the puppies now, where they have to climb over things and through things and round things in order to get to their food every day, and stuff like that, and making those harder. So it's the same context every day. The dog knows there's going to be some sort of challenge here. If I get through that challenge, I'm going to get something that's fairly nice the other side. Not massively nice, maybe a little bit of kibble, something, adequately nice. And then, so then you're building a pattern by which you can present new things to the puppies, and they're having this stressful situations that they're overcoming to get something nice. And then it allows you, if you go out on a walk and you see that the dog's like highly stressed by the bin bags, you go, oh, I'm going to do a bunch of bin bags tomorrow, and I'm going to put them in that really known environment where they know they're going to have something that they struggle with, that they know that there's going to be something there and that they always overcome, and you can go and get those bin bags and put them in that environment. So you're taking away all the other factors, you're taking away any kind of trigger stacking that can happen, and you've got like a really safe way to keep adding things that are more and more stressful for the puppy. So I really like that way of doing it. I also really like box feeding. Box feeding to me is game-changingly good, where the puppy eats out of the box, and all the time that he's eating, these different stressful things gradually get more and more and more stressful. And if he puts his head out of the box, then they stop, because the animal then is in control of what's happening, and they're in control of the stressor and their access to the food. The food never gets taken away. It's a really nice way to expose the puppy to lots of stressful things and build resilience, although that's probably a little bit more like exposure and habituation than it is really then stress inoculation. Although you could argue both is happening at the same time.
Is that just because I don't know if I want to make sure I'm thinking of the same thing as the box feeding, like what Pat Stewart does?
Yeah,
that type of box feeding. Okay.
Yeah, there's lots of variations of it, but that's definitely one way of doing it. And with the puppies, I do it much more simply in the sense of the food is in the box to start with. The thing is happening. If they take their head out of the food, the thing stops, and if they carry on eating, the thing continues.
The thing might be like you're tapping the side of the box with something, or
so with my Mondio puppies, we use all the Mondio paraphernalia, so clatter sticks.
Sure.
And in fact, it's the way that I initially exposed my dogs to gunshot too. So party poppers, and then gunshot happens over there, and then it happens closer, and it happens closer. If the dog lifts their head out of the box, then I know to continue at that distance until the dog will continue feeding whilst the gunshot's happening, and then closer and closer and closer. And it's a funny one, because it goes right back to the really, really early studies of when they had these cats that they electrocuted these cats in a box in a lab. Who was it? Holt or Yolt? Can't remember, one of the two. But they electrocuted cats in a lab in boxes, and they found that the cats were really stressed out, and then they wouldn't go in the boxes afterwards. And then they gradually exposed them to things that are more and more similar to the box whilst the cats were eating. And it was the first ever study of counter conditioning, really. It was the first ever time they found that pairing eating with something improved the animal's emotional response to it. And they believed that you couldn't be stressed and eat at the same time. But now, obviously, that's changed a lot. And now I think all of us who have ever worked with a resource guarding 16-week-old Doberman know that you can definitely be stressed and eat at the same time. But but that was the idea back then, that you couldn't eat if you were stressed, and that's kind of the idea behind using the box scenario as a way to inoculate puppies to stress, is the idea that if they're eating, then they're not too stressed if they're eating, especially when they understand the process, that if they stop eating, the thing stops, because it gives them the ability to tell us that they're where they are on that threshold of going from tolerable stress to a kind of toxic stress. I think it's a skill, learning where that threshold is in dogs, that's incredibly valuable as well, because in my experience of things like dog aggression and stuff like that, it's really, the closer a practitioner can go to that threshold of tolerable to toxic stress, the better the work, and the more bang for your buck you're getting. So for my mind, when you've got a novice trainer who's just starting out in behavior work, and they first start exposing dogs to other dogs, they're so scared of going over threshold that they keep their dogs pretty stress-free and pretty relaxed the whole time. And a lot of these kind of like Grisha Stewart habituation techniques, where they're just basically walking their dogs around equipment and scattering food on the floor, and the dog's never in any state of stress, that take years to see any proper behavior change sometimes. To me, that's, a more novice practitioner tends to stay down there. The more experience you get, and the more experienced practitioners I work with, are the ones who work closer and closer and closer to the threshold. When I go, I like to call it surfing the threshold. I like to really surf, if I can, that threshold of tolerable stress, where I know that the dog is just on the edge, but every time he is successful, those reps are worth so much to him, and it really changes his behavior a lot faster.
Yeah, and I think that's where sometimes leverage and even tools start to change, maybe, because now when you're working a dog closer to that threshold, and then maybe they go over threshold and are uncontrollable, it's like, certain tools will allow you to communicate to a dog still when they're ramped up.
Also, you have the real tricky cases, and this is where tool use goes into a grey area, because I don't use tools, for the record, at all. Like, I don't use e-collars or prong collars. I say tools, obviously I use like a hammer when I...
You don't use leashes? No.
Yeah, absolutely. For definition wise, I'm just talking about
yes,
prong collars and e-collars, but I don't use them. But it is difficult, and it's a real dilemma. It's a real ethical dilemma, because I've had cases before where you have, and it's usually, I've worked with a lot of bully breeds, and it is usually bully breeds when I'm talking about these particular dog aggression cases. Now, we're all very aware of like how important genetics are these days, and how important, what line your dog's from and stuff. So what happens when you get like my old pit bull, who was a London bred ex-fighting dog, right? So he's been bred through generation and generation to be epic at fighting dogs, and dare I say it, and lynch me, but dare I say it, he loved it. He'd love it. If he was allowed to fight dogs all day, he absolutely 100% would. He loved a good scrap. We can argue till the cows come home that maybe it was the relief of not dying no, he just loved a scrap. He loved it. The only way to give him his biological fulfillment really was for me to fight him, which is what I used to do on a daily basis, and just physically fight him, hold him to the ground, and he'd growl at me, and he'd launch at me, and he'd get me, and I'd get him back, and we fought each other every day for like 14 years. But he loved fighting, and if he could get to a dog and fight with a dog, then he would. He 100% would, and it poses a bit of an ethical dilemma, because a lot of the protocols that we have when it comes to like surfing threshold assumes fear, right? And it assumes that the dog, we've crossed this threshold, the dog is now in a place of unpleasantness, and the dog the dog doesn't want to be in, and we need to somehow get through his arousal and communicate with him to get him back under that threshold so we can carry on communicating to him. It doesn't bear into consideration the fact that a lot of dogs are intrinsically motivated to do the behavior,
and they're super committed to something now. They're like, I am doing that thing. Oh yeah.
Like,
and like
yes,
everything goes blank, and it's like they're seeing red, and there's no, you know, and that's where people are like sticking cookies in their face, and it's like, no, like that dog is locked and loaded.
Absolutely.
You know?
I'm going to stick cookies in his face at the moment. I mean, if I'm lucky, it could over justify it and punish the behavior with the cookies because I'm interrupting something that he finds really pleasurable, perhaps. But more than likely, I'm just rewarding him for doing what he loves doing, right? And so using food in that environment is no good if we're going to look in that kind of, if we're going to look through that Skinnerian lens. And the problem is that when you have a dog like that, when you're feeding it and going, well done, well done, well done, for not trying to fight that dog, it's very different than when you're going, well done, for managing to be around that thing that you find a bit scary. And this is where it's an ethical dilemma, isn't it? Because we need to tell the dog, no, that's completely socially unacceptable to do the thing that you've been bred to do for generations and generations, and that you really love it.
That's what I was just, I was, while Vinny was saying what he just said, I was just thinking about that, because I always, there's some cases that you get that come your way, and it's just like, no, you can't counter condition that instinctual response out of, you know, like it's, and like sometimes you need to somehow say no, or this is not acceptable in this situation.
Well, when you think about counter conditioning, what we're trying to do is change the emotional response of the dog. And normally we're trying to change it from avoidance to an appetitive response, or to like, I hate that thing, to I love that thing. But what that fails to recognize is that sometimes what we're trying to do is change it from I love fighting that thing to I shouldn't really fight that thing. And that's really difficult. And as a trainer that doesn't use those tools, I do tend to fall under the horrible umbrella in those situations of obediencing myself through it, and just trying to use the drives of the dog and massively condition a toy and teach the dog. I used to put puppies, actually, because if I saw dog aggression in young bully puppies, I'd put them on what I used to call the anti-socialization protocol, whereby I would teach the puppies right from day dot that they don't socialize with any other dogs. And it was massively successful, to be fair, because I ended up with a whole bunch of bullies that could be walked straight through a dog park without leads, just with the owner's side, no problem, because they've learned from day dot they do not ever socialize with other dogs, so they never get to express those genetics of fighting anyway, in best case scenario. And they're massively paid right from day dot of walking by the sides of the owner, but the owner has to be committed to not socializing their puppy, which is something that's really a really hard sell.
So I was actually gonna say, so like in these, you know, what do you, and I'm not saying this to try and put you on the spot, so
that's right.
But like, what do you do in like these scenarios where you're at that ethical dilemma, and you know, like either you or they've had a bunch of other trainers in the past that have done things, or the dog has a history at this point of doing whatever the behavior is. What do you do? I mean, because there's so many factors, and like, I guess this is where it gets tricky in going into that the science part of everything, because there's so many factors, because, you know, what's the owner's commitment level going to be like, not only to actually work with their dog, but then also the financial commitment to pay a professional to help them, especially if they've recycled a few trainers already. And now the dog has also practiced this response, maybe because it wasn't addressed properly, or it was accidentally reinforced for something that now has become more reinforcing than anything else. What do you do? And I know I'm not giving an example. But
like if we take the example of sheep killing, right? Sheep killing is probably the clearest example, isn't it? Like if you have, let's say we've got a bunch of German Shepherds that have gone out and killed a bunch of sheep, because they're these cases that we get through that is incredibly intrinsically reinforcing. It's biological fulfillment. It's everything that dog wants to do has been done, and it's predation, which we know even neurologically is quite different to other types of behavior. And incredibly difficult to interrupt. I like the example of predation for these sorts of things as well, because the ethics are slightly we're helped with the ethical side of it, because we're not just talking about the welfare of the dog, are we? We're talking about the welfare of the sheep and the animals that it's killing. And really, when it comes to aversives, death is the most aversive thing. I think we can all agree, right? Like in most cases, I've worked with dogs that I worked with a Vizsla once that was buried under the ground with her sister alive. Her sister died. She managed to get out with 2 broken legs, and she dragged herself to the main road, right, where she was picked up. And then she was rescued by this lovely couple. But it always reminds me that, like, dogs will choose life. Like in 99.9% of the time, the dogs will choose to live. And so when we look at the Lima scale, death has to be the last. There has to be like no stone unturned to choose to euthanize a dog. And so when it comes to those cases, for me, I do take a kind of a Lima approach, knowing my own limitations of my skill set. So I will do everything I can in my toolbox, and I'll get second pair of eyes and third pair of eyes on these cases to do everything they can in their skill set. And then I'll go to people who use methods that I don't use to look at those dogs, because I believe that I'd rather, if a trusted balance trainer who I know is very skilled comes over and he says, look, I can fix that, and I can fix that quickly, and the dog doesn't have to die, and it's not going to fight any other dogs and cause injury, or it's not going to kill any other sheep, right? And I'm in a situation where I genuinely think my skill set, I can't do that, then I think it's ethical for the owner and the dog to say, okay, I'm going to pass you over to my colleague and talk to him about whether or not you're happy with the methods that he's going to use, because I'm out of ideas. Now, touch wood, apart from predation cases, I've never come across a dog that I haven't been able to work through to a solution that's been safe and happy for the owner. But with the exception of predation cases. But I do believe in that, and I do think that what you said about owners' time and money is really relevant, because I like the Lima thing, I like the Lima idea, but I think that it doesn't include in it, which it has to, time and efficacy. Like time and efficacy have to fall into that ethical model, I think, because it's all right to say choose the least intrusive, minimally aversive thing to use, but that's not. That is also effective in the right time scale. Do you know what I mean? It has to be effective. Right? Otherwise, I'll tell you a story of in a kennels that I worked in, there was a dog that was frightened of cars. Was frightened of cars. Yeah, that's right. And so I went in, and the staff had done this really long chart of how they were going to work with it, with a clicker to click and treat this dog for coming out and going towards the car and looking at the car and getting in the car. Obviously, this dog couldn't be rehomed for the entire time that this was happening, right? And this plan, which was lovely, was going to take months. So I said, look, screw that, pick it up, put it in the car, we'll drive it down the road to the park, right? So we picked it up, chucked it in the car, drove it down the road to the park, got it out of the park, played with it for like 20 minutes. Yeah, go, good. Went back, did it again 15 minutes later, did it again half an hour later, did it again an hour later. By the end of the day, the dog was running and jumping in the car. Now, was that minimally aversive, least intrusive? No, absolutely not. The clicker training one would have been. But ethically, I wholeheartedly believe that was the right thing to do for that dog, because it meant the next week it could go to its new home. So time and how effective something is has to go in there.
Yeah, Vinny always, it's funny, every time we discuss the concept or the philosophy of Lima, Vinny's always asking the question of the time piece, because, and it's true, it's not something that is mentioned or talked about a lot. In one of the episodes, I had talked about a case I was working with that was very reactive. The dog was extremely reactive, and I worked with them for months, and it was going nowhere. And then I decided to put a head halter and a prong collar on the dog, and in 3 sessions, we were able to walk by other dogs where the dog was checking back in with us. And
I think the other important thing to think about in a case like that as well is the stress of the problematic behavior to the dog. Like, where does that fall into it? Because whilst the dog is reactive, depending on the motivation of the dog, obviously if you've got a dog like Archie, it's loving it, but whilst the dog is reactive in many cases, it's highly, highly stressful. And so to prolong the stress of the animal performing the behavior, not to mention the stress of the owners having to deal with it, and with that increased management failure piece on top of that, all of that has to go in there, doesn't it?
Yeah. And that's where I think that again, like that goes back to the science thing, you know, we're not like, we need to take a lot of things into account. All those months that dog was reacting was extremely stressful, not only for the dog, but for the family. And then all of a sudden within 3 lessons, we were able to achieve what the goal was for the family. I'm not saying like, I'm not blinded to the fact that it was suppressing the behavior, because it was, but the dog was able to at least start engaging, and we were able to open up a window essentially where we were able to now reinforce behavior and play and all these things that we couldn't do before. So it just makes me think, when I was reading some of the studies, and you know, it just made me think, well, what about these situations? Like the studies aren't taking these detailed things into account, which is a problem in a way, because we're promoting, you know, we're promoting whichever science you want to believe. And it's like, well, but it's a one-sided. So I guess my next question for you is going to be like, how can we get our colleagues or, you know, dog owners that are paying attention to things like this? Like, what should we be looking at to make our observations and understanding of the science more objective?
I think it's really, really difficult. And like, I hate to be someone who I don't really like the idea of regulation for a few reasons, but I do think that it could help here in a level, just for the level of transparency. It would have to be completely inclusive, but I do think that then we could have a lowest benchmark of practical skills and knowledge in order to start charging as a dog trainer, right? And then within that, you know, you'd need like an app that was kind of like a cross between TripAdvisor and Uber, I suppose, whereby you'd then put on there, you'd have all these symbols saying this person has attended 7 courses in the last 4 years, or this person has attended 27 courses in the last 4 years, and this person clearly specializes in these things because this is how you know, they've got to Mondio ring level 3, and so you'd build like these profiles that would be completely transparent, as well as the reviews of the owners, in terms, and I guess you could end up having on that, you would end up having some level of SMART goal, whereby you, right at the very beginning of your session, you say this is the objective, and then you'd fill out that, you know, it'd be kind of almost compulsory in my weird little dream world. It'd be almost compulsory for you to fill that out for each case. So you'd go, and it'd be very simple, and you'd just go the date, like this is the date, this is when the client's starting, the objective of the case is to do like dog aggression, and then you'd have different categories. So you might go to be able to socialize with other dogs off lead. Okay, so like that really, you'd say where the dog started, so you'd say like reactivity level of 10 or 5 or whatever it is, and you'd have little metrics in there, and then you'd be able to complete it and have the review come up, so that you'd be able to see very clearly then, you know, and you'd be able to get very clear data on this trainer with this problem on average takes this long to reach its resolution or whatever, and then you'd be able to ability check, I suppose, trainers who booked them. And then also, one of the biggest problems in our industry is the lack of data we have about trainers. So like, we don't know, there's no country that has any proper data on how many dog trainers there are in the country. There's like, nobody knows. Like how many people are, like, we don't know how many dog trainers there are. We don't know how many complaints come from. All the balance trainers will tell you that the vast majority of their clientele have been to positive training and it's ineffective. All the positive reinforcement trainers will go, the vast majority of my clients come from balance trainers and it was abusive. But we don't know any of that stuff. We don't know, there's no way for people to complain, so we can't tell where complaints are coming from. There's no way, like, we don't know any. So in order for us to begin to get some kind of level, we need to regulate more, as much for data collection as any other purpose, so that we can at least start getting the answers to those bigger questions, because otherwise we're just relying on scientists who are never out in the field training dogs, forming definitions and doing what is most of the time really shitty science.
So I'm going to ask a question that's going to be long-winded and all over the place. So everyone get ready.
Yes,
Because
he's
I want to
finally
touch on a
doing it.
lot of I want to touch on a lot of what you were just talking about, and then bring it back to this. So when reading the studies, and a contradictory kind of dialogues that I hear is balance training or using electric collars, choke collars, prong collars is like easier. It's an easier way. It takes more skill to use positive reinforcement. And when you look at the studies, it seems like they're showing that, for recall, dogs that are trained with electric collars are not recalling as, efficiently as the dogs that are using positive reinforcement. And do you want me to finish, or
no, I just want to add in there that science that you're talking about, the Mills and China stuff, was such a load of bullshit. You can just throw it
well, so that's where I'm going. So I'll just say, like, where I thought if studies would have came out and said, look, to me, using tools is more of like an ethical thing. Like, is the dog shut down, fearful, nervous? Are we causing undue harm? But it's like when I started noticing that the studies are showing that not using tools is more effective, that's where I started going, that's weird, because I've always thought of not using the tools as almost, I don't want to say like you're almost making it harder on yourself, which there's nothing wrong with that. Like you do monitoring, which is a very, I'm very new to it. I've been doing it for about a year. I don't think you're at an advantage. Maybe I'm wrong. Like, do you feel like you're at an advantage that you're not using tools? Because I think it is interesting that you're saying the science. Yeah, you're saying the science is kind of bunk, but then you're also not using tools, which is interesting. Like, that's why I feel like your perspective is very valuable, because you're not using the tools, but you're also saying that because that's the thing that gets me, is when people are like, oh, well, these balance trainers, like, they don't know what's most effective. And to tie that into what you were just talking about, and we've spoken on the podcast about this, is the one community has, look at my credentials in terms of certifications in schools, and look my grades on these things. Whereas the balance community might, again, I don't know if Ivan has any type of certification, but I know he does really well in a sport. So you look at that, and it's like, and it is hard. And I see where if you are just a pet parent, you're like, whoa, look at what that guy can do with his dog, is gonna impact your decision to hire him more than look at all those letters behind his name. You know what I mean? So what do you think about is it really more effective? It is effective for more thing. I could see, if your dog pees on the floor and you smack him in the head, yeah, obviously for potty training, using positive reinforcement is going to be better. But and then back to the studies, some of them, it's not a mix. It's not representing what people are actually doing. They're not just going out and going, hey, come. And then when the dog doesn't come, they're just shocking the hell out of it. There's other things going on there. So, I always just saw as, balance training or using a tool is not like taking a steroid, but it's you're adding something to your repertoire. And by not using it, you are handicapping yourself a little bit, or taking, something away, and you have to put more thought into what you're doing. Not to say that, again, I've made this argument, some of the balance trainers are using an extremely high level of thought into how they're using their tools, or even I've taken electronic collar courses that made my head hurt, because I was like, holy shit. I thought we just had to press the button, so I know that was long.
Now I have a pyramid tattooed on my arm so that I can tell when I'm meant to do it. Absolutely. So the first thing it makes me think about is the fact that I do think that there's two human elements that we have to put into perspective here. One of them is how reinforcing using punishment is, and we've known that for forever. Out of the dog training realm, we know that forever. It's incredibly reinforcing to punish someone for something and see a behavior stop. And I think that does, with great power comes great responsibility, as Spider-Man says. And I think it's really important. I would say my biggest criticism, if we're going to lump people into camps of the balance community, is the overuse of those tools once they get going. You see them being used at the drop of a hat. As soon as I went to,
I can use it for this and this and this and this, and then it's just for everything.
For sure, and for example, NAPOPO, the NAPOPO way of using tools really states that you should move back to reinforcement if the dog struggles in a new place, right? So if you're doing your positions and you're decided you're going to do them today on a golf buggy, then the dog fails them, you should be moving back to your reinforcement because you're saying that the dog doesn't know it in this environment, right? Have I ever seen an APOPO instructor even use that? No, never. If the dog fails, they're going to use the collar. And they always do. Like, it works in theory, but in practice, once the collar system is on, it's used. My other criticism of that very quickly is the fact that people don't use it. Like, I've never seen a collar that's only used to activate a dog. It's always used to correct a dog as well. Like, and to me, that blurs the lines. And I'd love to see a dog that has only ever been trained via activation on the collar. Like, I think that'd be super interesting to see the emotional response of that dog. So what I guess what I'm trying to get at there is the fact that using the collar is incredibly reinforcing for the trainer, and therefore what used to be, this is my last point of call, or this not necessarily my last point of call, but it goes somewhere on my Lima chart, and at some point I say, well, I know it's aversive to the dog, I'm going to use it, it's going to be my first point of call because it's easy and I know what I'm doing and it's quite clear, and I'll just get it on the dog because I think I'm going to end up getting there anyway. And so that becomes a problem, because then it is overused. And I think that to help that, the order by which we learn to use different methods should be something that's commonplace in dog training, right? So I think that you should have to have used, like, I don't know, let's say we start with fucking free shaping, right? Although the frustration levels, you could argue.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yes.
So let's start with luring. Right. Okay. So we're going to start with luring. So a brand new trainer and we start with luring, and then we move to capturing, and then we move to shaping, and then we move to free shaping. And as there's more and more risk to the animal's welfare, the trainer should be proficient in each tool before they move on to the next, rather than starting with those tools that use aversives, which actually many trainers now do. I think you shouldn't be allowed to do that. You should have to have worked up this other route first, because I do think that as well, actually, in those 0 to 5 behaviors, I think it's actually usually more effective and easier to train a dog with positive reinforcement. Yeah, a pet dog, training your average Joe pet puppy to not to piss on the carpet, and to to settle at night, and to you don't need any of those tools for that stuff.
Yeah,
like
no,
for those basic stuff, you don't need them. You can train all of that stuff. There's not even need them. That you wouldn't want them. It's easier and quicker to use like positive reinforcement based stuff, right? It's only when you start heading towards your competing motivator work.
Oh, we lost her again. Wait, hold on. We lost you for like 1 second. It said once you get into the competing motivating work.
Yeah, when you get into like competing motivators and stuff like that, that's when there's that grey area of when you go, that would be easier. Like that would, and to me, it almost falls dead on with your competing motivators. So for Mondio, for example, I can, like, the obedience is a piece of piss for me. With toys and food, I don't need anything else. For toys and food, it's a piece of piss. I can train good obedience. I got like full scores of my dog at the last trial in my obedience. I can do obedience without that. It's not hard. It's when the bite work happens and I'm trying to get my dog to stop biting.
Yeah.
But that's when it's more problematic, or when I'm trying to keep him in contact hill when there's decoys running around and getting me to ride a horse. It's and predation and dog aggression, when the motivation of the dog is to do the thing and you're saying not to do the thing, that's when it starts to get stickier, and that's when it starts to head into that tricky scenario where you go, I think, like like I said at the very beginning, the more complex those behaviors are and the more competing motivators they are, I think then when it comes to the ease, when it comes to just time and efficacy, forget about ethics and emotional contingents and leaking and the misuse of those and all that kind of stuff. When it just comes to time and efficacy, I think when you get up to those very high level and those very more complicated behavior problems, resource guarding, severe dog aggression in a dog that's highly motivated to be dog aggressive, predation, those sorts of cases, then I do think that using the tools is easier, quicker, and possibly, oh God, dare I say, I'm going to keep saying this, more effective on that
Oh
short
my God,
time
there's a
frame. On
soundbite.
that
There's a
short
soundbite
time
for the
frame.
episode
No,
right
no, no, no,
there.
no. On
That's
that,
it.
on that short time frame. I do think it's possible to overcome those behaviors using positive reinforcement techniques, but do I think it's as quick? Probably not. No.
Now here's my question while we're on like the sport of mondioring, and then because I feel like it can get right to the ethical argument.
Mm.
If you have a Malinois and you're doing bite work and its favorite thing in the world is biting the decoy, and let's just say for argument's sake, you can't change it with positive reinforcement or not using a tool. So you either have to never let your dog bite a decoy again, just manage it. No, don't, you know what, mondioring's not for that dog. Why would you make the dog do a sport where you're now using a tool? Or you're going to use a tool, there might be some slight discomfort or stress on your dog, but in return, that dog is going to be able to do something that it extremely enjoys and has a lot of, excitement doing. I know your answer. I mean, obviously you're not using tools, but if you were met with that, where would you fall on that ethically?
So it's really hard when we talk about sports because a lot of people don't understand the biological fulfillment that Malinois does get from doing.
Yes.
And there is a quality of life issue if my dog can't, especially my dogs that are not just as a breed but as lines bred to do that. I do think they could have I do think they could have a decent quality of life without mondioring, for sure. But my I guess my answer to that, my answer to that is going to be that it depends, because it depends on the way you use the tools as well, because I'm e-collar literate, even if I don't use them myself. And I'm e-collar literate enough to know that there are incredibly elegant ways of using those tools that are hardly aversive to those dogs at all. Right. And it comes back, I guess, right to the beginning of their definition of aversive. Is it tolerable stress that the dog can control and overcome? And is the Pavlovian response to going back into the Mondio field going to be incredibly positive? Yes. My dog's going to still be desperate to go back in there. And my dog is going to know that he can control those very low level aversives that are in the tolerable stress continuum. So if I was met with that problem, then I think maybe that would make me at least question my answer rather than go, no, the sport isn't for me. But thankfully, I've never had that question. My what that made me think about was the fact that my mentor, when I was a younger self, said to me once, if I could give your dog to Michael Ellis, this is when I had my dog reactive pit bull. And it was when I was really struggling with that whole piece. It was when I was, because you don't get taught any of this stuff at university, do you? You don't, like, you come out and you can on paper train a dog, but you can't actually train a dog at all. And I remember coming out and getting this pit bull and him completely out dogging me and ripping up every rule book I ever had and like just being a total nightmare. And I remember Ryan saying to me, like, if you could give the dog to Michael Ellis and he said to you, look, I am going to use the prong and the e-collar on your dog, but I'm going to give your dog back and he's going to be not dog aggressive at all, right? He's not going to be, there's going to be no level of dog aggression and you're not going to see any other changes. You're not going to see any other, but you're going to have a life now where you can take him to every dog seminar. You can take him to anything you want to. You can take him down the dog park and let him off the lead if you want to. Would you do it? And I remember that was the first time in my professional life when he said that I questioned it. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, fuck. Oh, that's so difficult. That's so difficult because it would give him such a better quality of life. And it's going to take me years. And it did take me years. And I did manage to get to a point where I could take him to dog seminars and like many people would have met me there with him and do the things that I wanted to do with him and compete and all that sort of stuff. But it did take me years to get to that place. And arguably, if I hadn't got to that place, I wouldn't be the trainer I am now. So maybe it's a good job. But I remember that there is definitely the ethical consideration there where you go, oh, but the amount of stress that he went through. The other ethical dilemma that I was posed with only 2 weeks ago when it comes to this real tricky thing was I was at Mondio this is a couple of months ago actually, but I was at Mondio and I had a little barking problem with my dog in the defense. So for people who don't know Mondio, the defense against the handler exercise needs your dog to stay in contact heel. He's not wearing a collar or a lead, and he stays in contact heel position with you. So he has to stay contact with your body the whole way through, while you have two decoys, so two men in the suits, that tell you what to do. And they tell you to do all kinds of ridiculous things like dancing and hanging things on washing lines and getting on bikes and all sorts of stuff. The dog has to stay in heel unless the decoys put two hands and slap you. And if they put two hands and slap you, the dog's allowed to come off you and bite. And you don't cue the dog to do this. The dog does it himself. Anyway, so I'm doing my defense against a handler and I start to get a little bit of a barking problem, right? And my dog starts to bark. And in Mondio Ring, unlike in PSA, barking is, they don't like barking because the idea is that the dog's wasting too much energy in barking, and that often dogs will lose their head and they kind of forget what they're doing and get a bit lost in the ring if they start barking. So Blake starts barking, and my trainer, who's a balance trainer, just says to me, just check him on his collar, on his flat collar. And I'm like, no, come on, I don't do that. And he's like, just check him because you need to provide him with. And I'm like, no, I don't do this. So instead, for about 6 weeks, I work through this little protocol where every time he barks, all the decoys have to stand still. And I walk him off the field and I bring him back on the field again and do it. And it put me in a really tricky ethical dilemma, because my coach was saying to me, look, we can get this done in one session and your dog is going to be super clear. At the moment, your dog is getting more and more frustrated because you keep taking him off the field and the decoys keep stopping and he's not really understanding why. And I'm going, oh, this is horrible.
I'm sure the decoys appreciated it too, right?
The decoys hated it. They're like, can we just get on with our job? And so it put me in this real sticky one, because it was that whole clarity piece where I was going, oh, in my little, because for me there's like these different pillars and they're like a weird little weighing machine, and each one has different weight and you have to work out which one's the heaviest weight. And I'm going, oh, clarity is really important to me, but as an ethic, as a tool, I suppose, or as a method, I've never used a correction on the lead like that before, and I don't want to. And then I'm going, in my head, I'm going, but that's me. I don't want to, because as a professional boundary, I've put this boundary on, even though I can see it's going to be clearer for my dog who is frustrated.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I
I was just, oh, go ahead.
And taking him away could be could be more aversive than you just going, hey, shut up.
Sure.
Hey, shut up for a second. I'll let you do what you want to do.
Absolutely. And I worked through my process and it worked, and it took a while and everyone got pissed off with me, but it worked. But now I look back at it in hindsight, it was a really interesting moment for me, because it made me go, oh, this is a situation where I am putting myself and my own professional ethics above what I believe to be truly best for my dog. And that's hard, man.
I was just gonna say, so one, I'm thinking in my head, like how possibly how frustrating is this for your dog, especially if you're removing your dog from this situation, as opposed to just telling your dog to knock it off, essentially.
Yeah.
And would that be clearer? And also, and hearing what you're saying, like I totally get what you're saying in terms of, I just don't feel comfortable doing that to my dog. And I'm just thinking, is it really going to even affect your dog?
Not at
in
all.
that moment? Because, and I have like a good example. When I started sheep herding with one of my Kelpies, he was in the zone and everything, and my instructor said, I'm gonna throw the feed sack towards him so he gets off of the stock, because he's coming in too tight and it could get dangerous for the stock. Okay, fine. His timing happened to be the same time my dog was there, and my dog got hit in the face. And I was like, like, and
in your head, did you go, oh, am I a balance trainer now?
You're a balance trainer now, that's it.
my dog was like, what the fuck was that? Wait, I don't give a shit right now. Let me keep working. And like my instructor and I still laugh about it, because I was so nervous, but it was a great moment to learn and see, well, that dog is in that drivey mode right now. Like everything else going on really didn't matter.
For sure.
And it just made it, and that just made me think about like your situation, because like I wouldn't have done what happened, but it just happened to be the timing was perfect the way it happened, and it was honestly, it was cool to see, because if that happened in my house, he'd be in a totally different state than when he was working the stock. And so I'm thinking the same thing for your situation.
Yeah, and my dogs are he's hard as nails, robust anyway. Like he's the kind of dog who, like when I first got him, I got him as a rescue at 18 months, and he was a little shit when I first got him, and he used to counter surf, and he'd like knock pans off, like smash, ching, 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 and you'd find him still on the counter, like doo, doo, doo. Like he doesn't really give a toss. Like he's incredibly like environmentally robust, like very, very. So like I don't doubt that if I did it, he would have gone, like he wouldn't have given a shit. But it's that thing, isn't it? It's that thing where, unfortunately, what's happened is that we've decided that there's two camps. Well, there's three camps. There's yank and crank, there's balanced, and there's positive.
Finally, someone said three. I keep saying this every freaking time we have this conversation. Everyone's like, there's two. Like, no, there's three. There is three. Finally.
There's the dog only gets told when he gets it wrong. There's the dog gets told when he's right and wrong, and then there's the dog gets told when he's right, basically, right? And the thing that my problem, one of the problems with it all is the fact that actually, when we look back in time, positive reinforcement training, or whatever we're going to call it, started as a backlash to the yank and crank trainers, and it used to be an umbrella that included balance training. And if we read like Jean Donaldson's early books, and like even Don't Shoot the Dog, like Karen Pryor's early books, it all included loads of like negative reinforcement stuff and punishment and slapping the dog. Like,
I can't believe you just said that.
Doing this on the dog's paws when they're on the counter, and using no, and even Victoria Stilwell's early shows had loads of stuff in it now that the positive community would go, "Whoa, you couldn't do that," right? Because it used to include all of that, because it only happened to say we shouldn't be putting dogs in a situation where we're making them get it wrong and then just telling them when they get it wrong. We should tell them when they get it right too. And so it used to include all of it, and then very slowly it's formed like two bits of it. So it used to all be positive reinforcement based training, and now it's balanced and positive reinforcement based under the same thing. And so because of that, it means there's there are a lot of trainers I know. There's trainers that call themselves balanced that are a lot closer to what I do than trainers that call themselves positive reinforcement based trainers. So it's such a weird thing. But what's happened is that we've got these three camps, and we've got tools and methods that are synonymous with each camp, rather than the emotional contingent of the dog. Really, what should be is we should have like how aversive something is. And really, if we were clever, we'd go, well, positive based, or like forgetting fucking Skinner, just slash that off. But positive based trainers are happy to go up to this point of the scale of aversive. Balanced trainers are happy to go up to this scale of the aversive. And then like yank and crank trainers are happy to go up to this scale of aversive for the dog, really. And then you'd be able to put the tools across all of them. Because if you were able to use the tools in a way which fits under how aversive it is for the dog here, then you could still be a positive trainer and still use an e-collar. Because it's about the emotional response of the dog, and it's about how the dog feels, and it's about the ethics for the dog. It's no longer about the specific tool or the specific method or all of that kind of stuff, because it doesn't really make sense to have the methods in it, because there's situations, like I said, where I felt really uncomfortable because I didn't want to use a leash pop, but only because it was synonymous with a type of trainer that isn't me.
Yeah.
And not because it was for the ethics of the dog. And if I'd just kind of lived, died on the sword or whatever it's called, and just gone, no, I'm happy as long as I'm not using aversive over this level, then I would have done the leash pops and it would have been better for my dog.
I'm glad you said that, because I think it's good. It's like a good reminder, but also just the process to look or think about things, because I think a lot of the time there's what you might think is ethical is going to be different for someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And then that brings a whole nother freaking conversation. I mean, even like the concept of Lima, there, like, as we've been learning, there's a few different concepts of what people consider Lima to be. Some will apply the use of tools, and then others won't. And you know, there's a lot of different variations on it, which gets confusing.
For sure, because the Lima scale really is what we're talking about how aversive something is, I guess, because how aversive and how invasive it is going to be just up that scale, isn't it? But like, it's funny because the vast majority of Lima trainers will only use up to a certain level of aversive, and then
But that
say,
depends
is that
on
really Lima?
But
Because
yes, I agree with what you're saying, but I think that's going to also depend on where they fall in line as a professional.
for sure.
Because like if you're looking at a professional who's more balanced but thoughtful in the way that they're doing things, they may use Lima differently or apply certain tools. Whereas, you know, I mean, like if you go to the APDT website and you fill out the form that says find out if you're Lima compliant, and so it's the first question said something about like, do you use tools, yes or no? So I was curious and I said yes, I use tools, and then automatically the answer was, well then you're not Lima compliant. And so it's weird because it's like, so there's a lot of different variations of that, you know, and you know, if you're more, I guess, more of a positive trainer, you're gonna follow a Lima scale to a degree and then stop, like what you were just describing. And then maybe if you're a balanced trainer, you might go as far as you need to go, but then also you may not start at a more positive level or something like that. You might just jump right to a tool depending on where you fall in line.
Competency as well. Competency. If you've only got 3 tools in your toolkit, then you know,
Yeah,
you're only going to have 3 levels that you're going to be able to go to. So competency is a massive factor in that. A massive factor. It's funny as well, because I do think that exposure really changes your opinion. So I was lucky enough to go and spend some time at Michael Ellis's a while ago, a couple of years ago, as well as a bunch of other trainers. And then subsequently moving to Spain, I don't have any option other than to train with balance trainers. So I've had a high level of exposure. And I do remember the first time that I saw like an e-collar being used to correct behavior, and thinking, if I'm dead honest, because of and I will use the word propaganda, because of the propaganda that sits underneath that tool, I do remember going, oh, is that it? Like, I was like, it was almost a level of, oh, I thought it was going to be, oh, all right. So that's that session. And oh yeah, the dog's doing it. I do remember thinking like, oh, I thought it was going to be like, in my head, the dog was going to scream out in pain and dive to the floor and like all this kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, it just twitched its ear. That's what you're gonna, okay, that's that then. And yeah, they are misused massively and blah, 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 blah. But I do think that there needs to be, I do wish that people were better educated in the tools that they don't like.
But I think that's why education matters. And I notice, you know, even on your own post, what people reply with is like, oh, well, I'm not going to learn from an animal abuser. Like I got shit on one time for recommending a balance trainer for like his tug videos that didn't have any tools or punishment in it at all. And everyone came on me like, oh, why would you ever give money to an abuser, right?
Yeah.
So
I got criticized for the same thing. I said, like, at the time I really liked the Leerberg balls on a rope. And I remember going, oh, Leerberg do really good ones. And then just people going, oh my God, no, I would never buy from Leerberg. And you're like, what? Do you not buy from Tesco's because you don't like some of the ethics behind their chicken? Like I don't understand. There are people that are crazy.
so just back to the effectiveness again, just to bring that up. If we were to do more studies, or you know, how would those studies be done? And then what if we did find out that using certain tools or balance methods were more effective? Then what? Then does the recommendations change?
Well, it was really interesting. I posted a question to my students, right? And I have to admit, I was disappointed by some of their answers. I'm sorry if you're listening. Not all of their answers. But
if you're listening, it wasn't you. It wasn't yours.
Definitely, your answer was the best answer. But so I wrote a question, and I wrote, if the science came back, if studies revealed and there was a body of work that highlighted that the use of e-collars could be done in a way that was ethical, that was not aversive to the dog, was timely and was exceptionally effective, would you take the time to learn to use these tools? And predominantly people said no. And I was like,
Huh.
Like I couldn't put two and two together. I was like, but no, because then I'm saying that they're not really horrible for the dog and that they're timely and effective. Like, why wouldn't you? What? Of course, your recommendation should change, right? Like,
That's where it
blows
becomes
my mind.
more of like a religious ideology, where it's more back to that dichotomy of like, this way is more effective versus this way is more ethical. And then it seems like the people that go down one of those, I mean, I am more of like an ethical type of thing. Like, if I don't want to use a tool, it's because like, if that dog looks sad and shut down, and that doesn't make me feel good,
Yeah.
but and if it's going to take me 6 months to teach my dog to come when I call them versus 1 week, but I'm doing it in a way that has a strong history of reinforcement, and my relationship with my dog is getting stronger versus just like, hey, you better do this right now or else you're going to get this. I'll take the 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And for me, I think it's also about a cohesive and complete communication system. Like, I like to believe that I've got 5 dogs. I like to believe that I can communicate pretty effectively with them, and in a way that's pretty predictable as well. Whilst I don't use tools and stuff, I'm not going to lie and say I don't say no to my dog or chastise them for doing stuff when they're like just fucking about or being naughty in real life, and they know that. Like, if I leave a chicken on the side and one of my dog goes, oh, I'm gonna have a look at that, I will. Oh, wait, get off, and collar grab her.
You don't just let them eat it? Come on,
I'm not just going to let her eat it. I'm not going to start paying 4 feet on the floor, because it's like I believe in having an honest relationship with them. And
and I like that you bring that up, because I find relationship also impacts what a punisher is. Like, look, I punish my dog sometimes. My 7-year-old dog is way different than my 1-year-old dog, is way different than if I'm at a client's house and I'm meeting dog for the first time. So like, another thing some of these studies don't take into account, and I feel like is a huge thing, is the relationship you have with your dog. I'm noticing, especially with my Malinois, that if I kind of catch him doing something and like, he kind of knows he's being a little jackass, like, he kind of, oh, you got me. Like, it's almost like that, like, oh, you got me, I know, versus like hey, this is unfair, I don't understand this. Yeah. And I don't know what you want from me, and I'm just gonna freeze and stare at you. And like, now, I never push him that hard, but a dog that might then be like, hey man, you're being unfair, and that might turn into aggression or some type of a handler redirection or something like that. And I see that, and it's funny that now that I have a relationship with him, yeah, if he jumps up on the table, I could poke him on the butt with my finger and go, hey dude, what are you doing? And he looks at me like, oh, you got me. And like, he wags his body, and he's not looking at me like, oh my God, I'm scared of you now, and like, I'm shut down and fearful. He knows, because whereas if I had a stray dog off the street that came into my house and went up on the table and I poked him in the butt, he might turn around and bite my hand. Sure. Like, who are you? The example I give my clients is like, if your brother or sister or mom told you something negative about you, like, hey, I've been noticing lately that you've been, missing out on whatever, you would take that differently than if just some idiot at the grocery store was like, hey, you know what, you're an asshole. You know what I mean? Because there's no relationship there. So, that criticism is coming from a different place.
Like, there's a predictability of rules in the house, right? They know they're not allowed to do certain stuff. Like,
yeah.
And they definitely have those different character responses. Like my youngest Mally bit, she's really sassy. Like, she's she didn't have an adolescence because she was born an adult, but she was she's really sassy. And like, if I say to her like, nay, like, as in don't do that, I'll go, nay,
yeah.
let's go. She looks at me like, where Blake would do exactly what you're doing, like a little goofy. She looks really indignantly. And she'll just give me this like look of disgust and stop doing
How
it.
dare.
Like, oh, me, bitch. Like, but they definitely do all have those little character responses, and that dialogue, I think, is super important. And as you say, that dialogue is not something that is taken into consideration in any study when it comes to using these things, when it comes to telling a dog off for doing something versus.
Well, also, if those studies are even studying dogs in a home, because some of them, like there was one in 2000. Yeah, there was one in 2006, 2007. I've written down here. It's called Clinical Signs Caused by the Use of Electronic Collars, Training Collars on Dogs in Everyday Life Situations.
She's already rolling
It was
her
with
eyes.
17 laboratory bred beagles. That's what it said. 17
Absolutely.
laboratory bred beagles. So it's like, and the best part was they were in a kennel and only taken out every day for an hour and a half for training. That was it.
Oof.
And
And it was in a building.
are terrible as well. The contingencies are terrible in that study.
Yeah. So and so it's kind of like, well, we're getting these results and we're testing them on dogs that aren't even living in a home in with a family, dogs that maybe are social and want to interact with people. They're not even getting that piece.
Worse still.
What's
Okay.
more aversive? What's more aversive?
Absolutely. And they forget about the human element, the fact that the dogs are born to want to be close to us. Scott, there was that horrible study by Scott where he used he electrocuted puppies every time a hand was reached out towards them at various ages. Oof. Right, so 6 weeks, 10 weeks, and 12 weeks, I believe. And every time the hands went and touched the puppies, they used an electric stim and stimulate the puppies for the hand coming out. And they found that actually between at 6 weeks and at 12 weeks, it had no detrimental effect. The puppies carried on seeking out human interaction, irrespective of that aversive, because that's how important humans are to puppies. Like that's how important, that's how hard we've bred these little beagle puppies to want to be around us and to want to
well, and you hear about like horrible abuse cases and the dogs are still super sweet and resilient and like even are still seeking out the owner, which is like that's almost what makes it most sad to me.
I've got a dog here that over 3 years was beaten badly enough that she's got a broken pelvis, 2 broken back legs and broken ribs that will never repair, as well as a shoulder blade that was pulled out of its socket and then left. So she's got another, like an additional, she's bored herself another socket. She'll be on painkillers for the rest of her life, little Mally. And she is the sweetest dog. Like out of all of my Malinois, the most affectionate, the most like just beautifully behaved. I can take her into the center of Malaga and she's like, love me, I love everybody. Like it's dogs are designed to have this interaction with us that is like playful and loving, but also they have to live in our worlds to do that, and they need to know the rules to some extent. But talking of studies, there's one study that I must go through before I go, which is the main one that everybody quotes because it drives me absolutely nuts. And that's the Mills and China one, which is one where they because this is the main one. It's the one that people use the most, and it's the thing.
And are we talking? This is the one that people use the most to say the science says. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. And it's this study that was done. So first off, one of the problems with it is that it was done such a long time ago. So it was done, I think, in 2006. It was the one that when you talked about efficacy, we'll come back to this in a minute, because the efficacy study, they used the same footage, right? So when they were measuring the recall and the sit, the trainers who were training with in those 3 groups, the e-collar trainers that weren't using the e-collar, and the
like random,
and the positive reinforcement trainers, they weren't told that they were training recall or sit, because they filmed them for a different study about predatory behavior, and then they used that footage to work out which of those 3 training methods was more ethical, right? So they used the predated footage, right? So even though that study came out, I believe in 2021, didn't it? The efficacy one.
I'm not sure. I took too many notes.
The technology in those e-collars was from 2006.
Oh, interesting. That's
right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So already there's this ethical dilemma where you go, well, hold on, the tool has completely changed. Like if you get a chameleon collar and you check it back to one of those.
And I mean, now they have like 130 levels. Those had like 5 or like 10,
and like a thing instead of a thing, and they're like a different thing now, right? And this sounds like me selling e-collars, and it really isn't. But this is just me trying to be fair with science, because the thing that frustrates me, I will change my opinion when I believe that there is enough data that tells me to change my opinion, and there isn't at the moment. But I want that I want that to be true. I want to be a dog trainer who is truly using the evidence to support the best practice that I can do. And therefore, I want the studies not to say what I want them to say. I want them to say what is, because otherwise there's no point in them. And that study, the main variables in that study, so they got these three groups. They got the e-collar group, the e-collar trainers, and the e-collar train. There's lots of good
still on the Mills study
Mills
you're talking,
China,
right?
yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
So there's some really good things about it. The first good thing about that study is that they match paired the sample. So they got a bunch of dogs, I think it's 14 dogs in each group, thereabouts. They got match paired the group. So they basically said, we're going to rate these dogs on how bad their predation problems are and make sure that the trainers in each group get approximately the same amount of bad dogs. So they get approximately the same amount of dogs that have actually killed sheep and ones that are just pulling towards them and blah, 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 blah. So that's one good thing that they did. Another good thing that they did is that they didn't just drag off, Joe from down the road who says he's got an e-collar. They used the e-collar trainers that the box of the e-collar said that they're recommended by the manufacturer.
Okay.
Which is one way of doing it that is better, because at least they're not just getting anyone, they're getting the ones that the manufacturers have said these guys are the ones to use, right? And then they gave them all these dogs. But there was two huge problems for me. First off, there doesn't appear to be, and I've read the study like 1,000 times looking for it, there doesn't appear to be any set goal, right? They've given them the predation dogs and they've said, train these dogs, like the problem is predation. But they haven't said, train these dogs to be reliable off-lead around livestock, or train these dogs to be reliable on lead walking past livestock, or these dogs should come back when they approach livestock at 1 meter from the livestock. There's no criteria, right? And so there's literally no data on how well any of the dogs did, other than whether or not the owners were satisfied, right? But if I was an owner and I went to a trainer and he said, in these 3 sessions, I'm going to train your dog to recall at 10 meters from the dog, and I trained the dog to do that, I'm going to be satisfied. And if I'm an owner that says your dog's going to be able to run free around these sheep, and then the dog's able to run free around the sheep, I'm going to be satisfied, right? So that doesn't work. Anyway, so then what they do is the trainers train. One of the big problems about the trainers training, other than that they don't have a set goal that's comparable in any way, shape or form, is that they train them in different locations. And one of them is training in an indoor undercover area in spring in the sun. The other one is being trained in the snow, right? So already you've got a temperature changes that's going to affect things like the dog's cortisol and how much the dog's able to learn, and blah 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 blah, depending on breed. And B, the behavior of the sheep, of course, which is going to have huge implications. And the dogs, like the dog's general welfare. Like if I put my Vizsla out in the snow, she's going to be shivering and yelping and sitting on the floor because she's the biggest wimp going, and my bulldog, to be fair. So, and if I put my Malleys in the hot sun indoors, they're going to be panting, right? And bearing in mind that those 3 behaviors that I've just said, like the shaking and the yelping and the panting, are all behaviors that they were literally measuring in that study. So the temperature piece is quite important. Secondly to that, they failed to mention in that study that the dogs in the group with the e-collar trainers moved significantly more than the dogs in the positive reinforcement thing. Now,
what do you mean?
Moved, as in then there was increased movement.
Got it. That they actually were moving more. Got it. Okay.
My guess would be that the positive reinforcement trainers were doing more clicker styles with the thing, and they were running more. But that's going to drastically affect the cortisol level, which is what they were measuring. Because a dog that's moving more releases a lot more cortisol than a dog that doesn't move. Like movement obviously is stressful for a body stressful as in, and so that's going to have huge implications on that. They then suggested that they were going to look at the dogs and they're going to see so they're measuring their cortisol levels, and they're also measuring the stress signals of the dog in those training situations, and then when they come back to those training situations. And And one of my big problems with this is that we talk about using microsignaling for stress and measuring this a lot in science, don't we? So a lot of the time we measure things like yawning, the licking of the nose, panting, all these behaviors, yeah. But what's fascinating is that if you keep, like, you look at, well, hold on, who says those things are stress signals? And then you keep going backwards and backwards. There's no scientific data to suggest that those things are stress signals. And in fact, the scientific data on it says that it's almost impossible to work out whether or not a dog is apprehensive or whether or not they are anticipating or whether or not they are stressed based on those signals. It's almost impossible because the vast majority of dogs perform all those micro signals when they're apprehensive, when they're anticipating something good, and when they're stressed. So already the very measures to measure stress are not coming from within the scientific community. They're coming from basically from the calming signals book that was written ages ago by Rodriguez the hippie, and like it couldn't be less scientific if it wanted to be, really. Get the crystals out next, but so it just drives me mad. So they're then basing it based on these stress signals, right? But the thing that fascinates me about that study is the fact that they're checking out the stress signals of the dog in that situation. Now, if I get my 6-year-old, right, and I say to him, I'm going to teach you how to read, right, and we're going to sit in this, you're going to read this book over here, and every time he attempts to open a page, I go to him, yeah, good boy, I'm going to give you a Kinder Egg, well done, you're super, I love you, oh, give me a cuddle, right? And then I take him into another room with an actual teacher who says, right, sit down. Here, sit on the chair. We're not going to sit on the bed. We're going to sit on the chair, and there's the book. And no, it's not that. It's this one, right? Okay, so now you've got to blend your words. Do you remember how to blend your words? No, you can't play with that. Come back here, do this, and gives him positive and negative outcomes for his, and consequences for his behavior, right? Even if none of those are in any way aversive. Do you think that my child's going to have enjoyed sitting with me and snuggling and playing with Kinder Eggs more, or being sat down and told how to do something and being given consequences for getting it right and getting it wrong more? Well, he's going to enjoy the nice stuff more, right? There's going to be less stress signals when he's playing with me than when he's being taught something with them. So without any measure of success or efficacy, the dog is going to enjoy being given reinforcement only in that situation significantly more than being given reinforcement and punishment in that moment, right? But that doesn't necessarily have any bearing on the ethics of those sessions, because if that session was found to be effective and that dog was then able to run off lead for the rest of its life, and these sessions were found to be ineffective and that dog had to stay on lead for the rest of its life, or vice versa, and these dogs that went through the balanced methods with those old historic e-collar trainers then went home and bit their owners, and these guys were happy and healthy for the rest of their lives, then that's going to have completely different weighting. But it didn't measure any of that stuff. It only measured the stress of the dog within the session. So it's that study, all that study told us was that if you put a dog in the cold with a trainer that uses an old historical e-collar on you, you're going to enjoy it less than if you're in the warm with a trainer that only uses treats. That's all it told us. And yet it's used again and again and again. And the scientists have used the videos of that to look at efficacy, and brought out a study last year, which I felt was really unfair on the balance trainers. Brought a study out last year, so it looks like this super modern study on efficacy. And you're like, when you get into the minutiae of it, you go, oh no, hold on, it's the videos from 2006. They're just analysing the videos with that old technology, the old trainers with the old training style before they started to develop different things like NAPOPO or activation or all these different ways of using these, much more technologically advanced things. We're going to bypass that, and we're going to look at the efficacy from 2006. The science, the body of work isn't there. It isn't fair on either community, but for the current discussions going on between Ivan and Zach, it's like, to me, it's just a pointless conversation, because you're like, we just don't have the science. you can't say the science says either, because it doesn't say either, because the science is shitty, because we haven't come up with the definitions that we need in order to perform the science yet.
I think this answered my question from an hour ago, which was, I was saying, how could we look at, or how could professionals look at things more objectively, or what to take into consideration? Because I think, I guess I don't know that as I read through the studies that I thought about the technology piece, even though I know that it's changed drastically. I don't know that it dawned on me, to be very honest.
Mm.
But I would also say that trainers who aren't going to use maybe an electric collar, they're not going to care if the technology is from 2000 or 2023.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think that they're gonna necessarily care. And I'm not I'm not discounting that at all, because like I'm taking one of the Mike Ellis courses to understand a lot more about the electric collar. And so I'm not even arguing, one way or the other. I'm just stating that I think that I don't know that it would be like people wouldn't necessarily care about that.
But they should. That's my point.
Yeah, for sure.
If you're not going to like a tool, if you're going to, I choose not to use it. So because I choose not to use it, I want to be as educated as possible on it, and I want to make sure that I'm completely up to date with what the scientific community is feeding back to us about that tool, and B, what the training community is feeding back about that tool, so that I'm ready to change my mind if the balance weighs in a different direction. And I start to say, well, actually, it's going to be worth my while in learning to actually use this tool, because it turns out that it isn't as unethical as I thought it was, or it isn't as aversive to the dog as I thought it was, or it, or in the balance of things, when I look at my pillars of training, it's going to be something that fits within my own ethics. I think we need to fall out with these labels of positive and balanced and all that bullshit. I think that the further we keep in us and them, the more foolish we become as an industry, because it wastes everybody's time. I don't think any owner gives a flying shit about what you call yourself. I think you're only ever labeling yourself under those guises for other trainers. I think we need to put a lot less emphasis on the quadrant, because it's irrelevant most of the time. And if we actually just look at the training practicality, is the behavior increasing or decreasing? Like, that's important, like super important. And there's various different metrics, but so is the emotion of the animal, and how intrinsically rewarding a behavior is, and whether or not it's a competing motivator or not, and whether or not the dog's been bred to do it. All those other things are more important, probably, particularly when it comes to stopping behavior safely. And I think we just got to wait for the science to catch up, or have better cohesion between people out in the field and people in the lab, so that the people in the lab understand the things that are going on in the field, so that they can test them, rather than testing these weird arbitrary things like how many studies are there about whether or not a dog can follow a point? And you're like, really? Do we need another study on whether or not the dog's going to follow the point around the fence?
But then what does it say about these associations that are backing it? Like when you see Zach say like, oh, well, like here's this long list, like that's what makes it hard too, is because it does provide rationale for someone like him to say like, look, I am backed by almost like all these organizations, so then it's like, and I think that's why it goes beyond just like trainers educating themselves, because if the science is shaky, which you're kind of saying, but then the science is being used by organizations to have these position statements, and then those position statements are then used to label almost like a whole half of dog trainers as unethical and outdated and abusive, and they have to go away, and we just have to shut them up and don't listen to them and don't support them, and they're all abusers, like then it's like, where, like, I don't know, it almost, yeah,
it's horrible. It's horrible. Like I get in a lot of trouble for being too supportive of the balance community when I don't use tools, by my own community, but at the end of the day, I feel bad because there isn't enough, that we don't have the science to support those opinions. And I think it's really easy to stay popular, especially if you're one of those big associations. And for sure, like if positive reinforcement based training was more effective and worked in every case of competing motivators and high predation and, you know, severe resource guarding by dogs that are bred to resource guard and things like this, then like there wouldn't, like, then I don't see how any trainer would have a problem with those position statements, because we'd all go, yeah, fair one. It's better to use something nice that's effective than something that's a little bit unpleasant for the dog that's effective. But it isn't that easy. And dogs are being put to sleep or medicated or put into these highly difficult positions, which is why it's so controversial in our actual industry, rather than by the people who are sitting in an office in an armchair, who last time they trained a dog was a Scottish Terrier in 1964, and who have like read through these studies and go, oh, well, I'll just read the conclusion because it's easier, or I'll just read the abstract. Yep, this is another tick for positive reinforcement, you know, or like, oh, brilliant, it's going to bring in a lot more, you know. You're not going to sit as a charity and go, we support the use of electric collars on dogs. Please give us your money and pay for our kennels. You know, like it's there's so much politics surrounding it, and so much of that politics is about popularity, that there is a huge propaganda piece when it comes to the science-based stuff. You know, like in my eyes, you've got DEFRA who have said, look, we basically want to ban shock collars. Here's £64,000. Can you show us that they're not necessary? Yes, no problem, Sarah. I'll go and do that in my scientific lab with, you know, when the only dog I've ever owned was a elderly Jack Russell. And the last time I touched a dog, you know, was when my grandchild was you know, it's really frustrating for people who are out there in the field, because we all know that there's no dispute that those tools work, right? If you're a practical trainer, if you're someone who's out there training, there's no dispute that when they're used properly, those tools work. There is some dispute, and I've lectured about predation all over the world, and I always come up with this challenge, and I say, can you show me, if you're a positive based trainer, can you show me a before and after of your dog in predation, and then your dog in that same situation not in predation, right? And I haven't had a video back yet. And I've lectured all around the world to thousands and thousands of people asking for that. I've had some brilliant recalls, like some wicked rapid recalls off like Malinois coming off a squirrel, and previously it shown Mally chasing the squirrel, and so on and so forth. I get a lot of people coming back going, but getting a before video is unethical. And you're like, no, not when it's going to change the lives of thousands of dogs in the future. And you know, so but to it is possible. Like I've habituated my dogs around livestock where there's mild predation. I've had one Mally in my life who was so highly predatory that we were on a football pitch once, and she was on the end of a lead, and she sniffed the floor. And I swear on my life, I've got 2 witnesses for this. She was sniffing the floor, and I was thinking, what's she sniffing the floor about? Oh, well, I was having a conversation with someone. And then she went, and she head-butted the floor and popped out the head of a rabbit. Like she must have smelt it coming underneath her, or being underneath her, and she literally head-butted the floor and popped out. Like she was insanely predatory, and we were never able to get her to a place where she wasn't managed around predation, about you know, around those problems. Luckily, we moved to Spain, and it isn't such a problem here, but it was a massive problem when we were living in Herefordshire, which is right next to Wales, where there were sheep everywhere. And so she just had to go on lead, because and even on lead, she plucked a rabbit twice. She plucked rabbits out the hedgerow and killed them. And so that's not exactly ethical, these poor healthy rabbits that were killed. And that's with 2, at the time, I like to think, fairly well skilled dog trainers working nearly every day on predation stuff, you know. So there is a question mark as to whether or not, hello mate, there is a question mark, come on, as to whether or not the positive reinforcement based methods are effective in some of those super really severe cases of predation, or of like highly intrinsically valuable biologically motivated behavior. So until those things are reconciled, it's just I think it's really unfair to say, well, let's ban it, because we are killing dogs by banning those tools. However, the argument on the other side is, should they be available to everybody? Absolutely not. Should there be education that underpins them? Absolutely. Should owners be able to buy them off the internet? For sure, no way. But it's just so much more complex. It's so much more complex than you think it is when you start, and when you first come out of the training womb and you go, oh my God, that's it. This is, positive reinforcement for the win. You can solve everything with a clicker, and these horrible, disgusting electric shock collars that are gonna, if they go on the dog's gonna be burnt around the neck, and it's, that it's never gonna recover. That's not true. That's not true either. Like the truth of the matter is going to be a middle ground, isn't it? And just, I guess people just need to learn to be a little bit more decent, really, and smart about their choices.
Yeah, and that middle ground, that's kind of been the theme almost every one of these episodes we do. We're trying to find that because things are polarized, and we find that there are a lot of talented, sane, well-spoken people, knowledgeable, that are in the middle. So I don't know if you guys have anything else. No, that was great. I don't want to keep you any longer. We keep breaking the record for the length of the episode. So I really appreciate that. I think Anthony usually asks where people might be able to find you.
Oh, okay. So
what you're doing.
You can find me at the School of Canine Science, which is our online education platform. And if it's okay with you guys, I'll be told off if I don't say it. There is a discount code for anybody who listens to the podcast on any of our online courses, which is
Shock Collars 22.
Oh, I'm going to be in so much trouble for saying off. The thing is with me is that I'm just really, really keen to stay as authentic as possible. Like, I really want to be authentic, and I don't.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm messing. I'm just messing with you.
It's so funny because it's so funny you said that, because I was thinking prong collars, but I didn't know what to say after.
All capital letters, Canine Class. And it will give you 25% off any of the courses.
Canine, the word.
Canine Class. Canine Class, all one word. Canine, CANINE, CLASS.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This is awesome.
That's all right. No problem. No problem at all. It'd be nice to talk to you again in 2 years' time, when I've probably done another 180 and changed my opinion on everything all over again.
Yes.
We'll have you there.
Right, guys.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Canine Classroom. If you liked the show, make sure to smack that like button, share the show with your friends, and give us a rating. Until next time, class dismissed.